The doors of the throne room slammed shut behind me before I even had time to breathe. My name is Ethan Cole, and I was about to be married to a woman who ruled 1,000 worlds and hated my entire species. The air inside the Threxan throne hall smelled like burnt metal and something sweet I could not name. Guards twice my height stood in rows along both sides of the chamber, their armor glowing faintly blue, their eyes fixed on me like I was livestock being led to slaughter. I kept walking. I had trained myself for years not to show fear, and today of all days, I was not going to start. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from black crystal, was Empress Vale Threxa. She did not stand when I entered. She did not even look up right away. She was studying a data screen floating beside her, and when she finally lifted her eyes to me, I saw exactly what I expected to see. Contempt. "So this is what Earth sends us," she said, her voice smooth and cold, carrying easily across the silent hall. A single soldier, dressed like a diplomat, pretending he understands what an honor this is. I said nothing. I had been told, over and over, by our own ambassadors, that silence was survival. Earth had lost the border conflict. We did not have the ships, the numbers, or the weapons to argue with an empire that spanned 1,000 star systems. This marriage, this humiliating tribute, was the price of peace. I was the price of peace. "Kneel," she said. I knelt. It was not weakness. It was strategy. I told myself that with every step, every bow, every silence, I swallowed. A soldier who kneels today can stand again tomorrow. A soldier who fights today, with nothing behind him, simply dies. The court around me began to laugh, not loudly, not all at once, but in that quiet, cruel way that spreads through a room full of people who all agree on something ugly. I heard whispers in a language I did not fully understand yet, but I understood tone. I understood the shape of mockery in any language. "Look at it," one noble said, loud enough for me to hear. "It shakes." I was not shaking. My hands were steady. But it did not matter what was true. It only mattered what they wanted to believe. The Empress rose from her throne and walked down the steps toward me, her long robes trailing behind her like smoke. She stopped a few feet away and looked down at me, the way someone looks at an insect they are deciding whether to step on. "Do you know why I agreed to this marriage, human?" she asked. I lifted my eyes, just slightly. "To end the war," I said. "To end the war," she repeated, smiling now. "And to remind every world watching what happens to those who challenge the empire. You are not a husband, you are a lesson. A crawling species, kneeling before its betters, dressed up in ceremony, so it feels less like the surrender it truly is." The laughter grew louder. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my face calm. Somewhere behind that calm, something old and quiet was waking up. Not anger exactly, something colder than anger, something more patient. "You may rise," she said, turning away from me as if I had already stopped being interesting. "We will proceed with the ceremony. The galaxy is watching, after all. Let them see how gently we treat our pets." The word pet landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of laughter spread outward. I stood up slowly, brushing off my knees, and for one moment, just one, I let myself speak without permission. "You will regret laughing at me," I said, quietly, but clearly enough that the nobles nearest to me went silent. The Empress turned back, one eyebrow raised, clearly amused rather than concerned. "Is that a threat, human?" "No," I said. "It is a promise." She laughed then, a real laugh, the kind that comes from someone who genuinely believes they have nothing to fear. The court joined her, and the sound of it filled the hall, bouncing off crystal walls built to hold 1,000 years of Threxan history. I stood there and let them laugh. I let every sound wash over me and settle somewhere deep, somewhere I could keep it. They did not know who I really was. That was the point. Earth's diplomats had made sure of it before I ever stepped onto the transport ship that carried me here. My military record had been quietly sealed, buried under layers of paperwork and false assignments. To the Threxan court, I was nothing more than a low-ranking officer, chosen at random, or perhaps chosen because I was expendable, a nobody, a face they would forget within a week. What they did not know was that I had spent 6 years in Earth's Deep Operations Division, the part of our military that never appears in public records, the part that trains people to survive behind enemy lines with nothing but patience and precision. I had led missions that no one back home would ever hear about. I understood how to wait. I understood how to watch. And most importantly, I understood how to turn an enemy's confidence into their greatest weakness. The ceremony continued around me in a blur of chanting and ritual I barely paid attention to. I stood beside the Empress, our hands bound together with a golden cord that symbolized unity, though there was nothing united about the way she looked at me, or the way her court looked at me, like I was a strange animal that had wandered too far from its cage. When it was finally over, when the last chant had faded and the golden cord was removed, the Empress leaned close to me, close enough that only I could hear her words. "Do not mistake this marriage for power, human," she whispered. "You will live in this palace as my husband in name only. You will have no authority, no voice, no place in matters that concern the empire. You are decoration, nothing more." "I understand," I said, and I did understand. I understood perfectly. She had just told me, without meaning to, exactly what she believed about me. She believed I was harmless. She believed I was too foolish, too weak, too insignificant to matter. She had just made the first mistake of many. As the guards led me away from the throne room, toward the quarters that would become my new home, I looked back one last time. The Empress had already returned to her throne, already speaking with one of her advisors, already forgetting that I existed. That was fine. Let her forget. Let the whole empire forget. I had 6 years of training that told me the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone assumes does not matter. I had spent my whole career learning how to disappear into the background, how to become invisible, how to let people underestimate me until the moment it was too late for them to change their minds. Earth had not sent me here only as a peace offering. That much was true, and that much was known to almost no one, not even to some of our own ambassadors who believed the marriage truly was a surrender. But a small circle within our military command had a different plan entirely. They had chosen me specifically because I could survive inside enemy territory without being noticed, because I could gather information no soldier on the battlefield ever could, because a palace full of careless nobles who believed humanity was beneath them would speak freely in front of a husband they considered furniture. The Empress had called me a pet. She had called me a lesson. She had promised the galaxy that this marriage would show everyone what happened to those who defied the empire. She was right about one thing: the galaxy was watching. She simply did not yet understand what they were about to witness. As the heavy doors of my new quarters closed behind me, sealing me inside a room built more like a cage than a home, I allowed myself, for the first time since arriving on this world, to smile. Let them laugh today. I had learned, a long time ago, that the ones who laugh first are rarely the ones who laugh last. My new quarters were beautiful in the way a locked box can be beautiful. Tall windows looked out over gardens filled with plants that glowed faintly at night, floors made of polished black stone, furniture carved with symbols I did not yet understand. It was a cage decorated to look like a palace, and I knew it the moment the doors sealed shut behind me on that first night. 2 guards stood outside my door at all times. Another 2 watched the gardens below my window. A servant, named Eurus, a quiet alien with pale gray skin and careful eyes, brought me meals 3 times a day and never once made conversation longer than a few polite words. Everyone around me had clearly been given the same instructions. Watch him. Do not trust him. Do not let him wander. I understood why. To them, I was a symbol of a defeated species, and symbols require careful handling. What they did not understand was that a cage only works if the person inside believes they are truly trapped. I did not believe that. Not for one moment. The first week, I did exactly what they expected. I stayed in my quarters. I asked no questions. I let the guards see a man who was quiet, a little lost, a little sad, exactly the kind of harmless creature the Empress had described in front of her entire court. I ate my meals slowly. I walked the gardens under close watch, always keeping my hands visible, always keeping my eyes down, just enough to seem defeated. But I was not defeated. I was listening. Guards talk when they think no one important is nearby, and to them, I was not important. I heard fragments of conversations about supply routes, about tensions between noble houses, about a growing unrest on some of the empire's outer worlds where taxes had been raised twice in a single year. None of it seemed useful at first, just noise, just the background hum of an empire running its daily business. But I had been trained to remember noise. Noise, collected patiently over time, eventually becomes a pattern, and patterns become opportunities. On the 5th day, I met Lyra for the first time. She was one of the palace guards assigned to the garden, younger than most of the others, with sharp eyes that seemed to actually look at me rather than through me. I had noticed her watching me with something other than suspicion, curiosity maybe, or boredom. Either one could be useful. "You do not speak much," she said one afternoon, breaking the silence that usually surrounded my walks. "I was told to be quiet," I said. Seemed like good advice. She almost smiled. Almost. "Smart human," she said. "Most of the court expected you to cry, or beg, or run. You did none of those things. Would it have changed anything if I had?" "No," she admitted, "but it would have been more entertaining for them." I let that sit for a moment before responding. "I am not here for their entertainment." "No," Lyra said, studying me a little longer than necessary. "I do not think you are." It was a small conversation, nothing more than a few sentences exchanged over garden stones, but it told me something important. Not everyone inside this empire agreed with how I was being treated. Not everyone found the mockery amusing. There were cracks in the unity the Empress liked to display, small ones, quiet ones, but cracks all the same. Over the following weeks, I began mapping those cracks the way a soldier maps terrain before a mission. I learned, slowly and carefully, that the Threxan court was not the single, loyal body it appeared to be from the outside. There were noble houses that resented the Empress's growing power, families who had once ruled independent systems before being absorbed into the empire generations ago and had never fully accepted their loss of freedom. There were military officers who quietly disagreed with how aggressively the empire expanded, worried that resources were being spent on conquest instead of protecting the systems they already controlled. And there were entire outer worlds, distant from the glittering capital, who saw very little benefit from the empire's wealth, despite paying heavily into its treasury. None of this was written anywhere I could access directly. It was gathered one conversation at a time, one overheard argument at a time, one careless comment from a noble who assumed the quiet human husband understood nothing of their language or their politics. I made sure they kept assuming that. During the day, I played my part perfectly. I attended small ceremonial functions where I was required to stand beside the Empress and say nothing. I bowed when expected. I wore the clothing the palace provided without complaint. I let nobles whisper insults in front of me, sometimes even smiling politely as though I had not understood a word, even when I understood every syllable. The Empress herself rarely spoke to me directly during those weeks. When she did, it was brief, businesslike, always with that same undertone of dismissal, as though addressing a servant rather than a husband. I let her believe that suited me perfectly. The less attention she paid me, the more freedom I had to observe everything around her. It was during the 6th week that I encountered Lord Kryn for the first time, a noble whose family, I had learned through careful listening, had lost significant territory to the crown 2 generations earlier. He approached me in the garden one evening, his expression carrying the same practiced contempt most nobles wore around me, but his eyes held something sharper. Calculation. "The Empress's little pet," he said, circling me slowly. "Tell me, human, do you enjoy your cage?" I kept my expression calm, my posture relaxed. "It has a nice view," I said simply. He laughed, though it was not a kind laugh. "Clever. I wonder if that cleverness will save you when she grows bored of this arrangement. Empresses have a habit of discarding things they no longer find useful." "Is that a warning?" I asked. "Consider it a courtesy," he said. One creature who understands what it means to lose everything, offering advice to another. It was the first time anyone in the palace had spoken to me as though I might actually be worth talking to, even if his words were wrapped in insult. I filed away everything about that conversation, his resentment toward the crown, his willingness to speak so openly about the Empress's temperament, the way he studied me, clearly trying to determine whether I might be useful to whatever quiet ambitions he carried. I gave him nothing that evening. I simply thanked him for his advice and returned to my quarters. But I remembered his name, and I remembered the bitterness in his voice, and I understood that somewhere in this glittering empire there were people who wanted change just as badly as I did, even if their reasons were entirely different from mine. Weeks passed. I continued gathering pieces, quietly, patiently, never rushing, never showing more curiosity than a bored prisoner might reasonably show. I learned the names of guards who resented their assignments, servants who whispered about unfair treatment, and officers who spoke of the empire's military stretched too thin across too many conquered systems. I also began training in private, in the small hours before dawn when the palace was quietest. My quarters had enough space for careful, quiet exercise, and I made sure to keep my body sharp, my reflexes ready, even while presenting a picture of someone slowly wasting away in captivity. If the guards noticed the light exercise through my window, they said nothing. Perhaps they assumed it was simply restlessness. Perhaps they did not care enough to report it. Either way, it worked in my favor. The turning point came during the 9th week. During a private audience, the Empress finally called me to attend. She sat on a smaller throne this time, in a private chamber rather than the grand hall, with only 2 guards and 1 advisor present. She studied me for a long moment before speaking. "You have been quiet," she said. "Unusually quiet, even for a defeated species." "I was told my role was decoration," I said. "Decoration does not speak unless spoken to." Something flickered across her face, something that might have been curiosity or might have been irritation. It was difficult to tell with her. "The court finds your silence unsettling," she said. "They expected tears by now, or anger." "I have neither to give them," I said. She rose from her throne and walked slowly around me, much like she had during our first meeting, though this time her steps felt less like mockery and more like genuine study. "There is something about you, human, that I cannot quite place," she said. "You kneel without breaking, you smile without meaning it, you watch everything and say nothing." "I am simply trying to survive," I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping my eyes just slightly lowered, exactly the picture of humility she expected. "Survive," she repeated softly, as though testing the word. "Perhaps, or perhaps you are simply better at hiding than most of your species." For a moment, I thought she had seen through me completely. My pulse quickened, though I kept my face perfectly calm. But then she waved a hand dismissively, as though dismissing her own suspicion as foolishness. "No matter," she said. "The court has requested a display, a trial, of sorts, to remind the empire what humanity truly is beneath its polite manners. You will participate." I felt something settle in my chest, cold and steady. "What kind of trial?" "A test of worth," she said simply. "Nothing you need concern yourself with in detail yet. Simply know that the entire empire will be watching." I bowed my head, the same humble gesture I had performed 100 times before. "As you wish," I said. But inside, something had shifted. The Empress believed she was preparing to humiliate me publicly, to prove once and for all that humanity was as weak and pitiful as her court believed. She believed this trial would be the final confirmation of everything she had mocked me for since the day I arrived. She had no idea that she was about to hand me exactly what I needed: a stage, an audience across 1,000 worlds, and a reason, finally, to stop hiding what I truly was. As I walked back to my quarters that night, past guards who barely glanced at me anymore, past gardens that glowed softly under 2 distant moons, I allowed myself once again to think about the promise I had made in that throne room weeks ago. You will regret laughing at me. The trial was coming, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, I found myself almost looking forward to it. The arena was built into the side of a mountain, carved out over centuries, tall enough that clouds sometimes drifted across the upper seats. On the morning of the trial, every seat was filled. Nobles from every noble house, officers from every branch of the military, and broadcast drones hovering silently above the crowd, ready to send this moment to every screen across 1,000 worlds. I stood at the center of the arena floor, wearing simple training clothes provided by the palace. Nothing like armor, nothing meant to protect me. That was the point. The Empress wanted the galaxy to see a human standing exposed, vulnerable, facing whatever challenges her court had designed to break me. She sat above the arena in a private viewing box, dressed in ceremonial robes, her expression calm and confident. Beside her sat several of her most trusted advisors, and a few rows below, I spotted Lord Kryn watching with unreadable eyes. An announcer's voice echoed through the arena, amplified and sharp. Let the trial of worth begin. Let the galaxy witness what the Empire has taken as tribute. The first challenge was called the Gauntlet of Endurance. A series of moving platforms rose from the arena floor, shifting and tilting unpredictably, forcing anyone who attempted to cross to rely on balance, timing, and raw physical stamina. Most species who attempted such a course, I had been told quietly by Eurus the night before, struggled simply because Threxan bodies were built for strength rather than agility. I did not struggle the way they expected. Years of training in Earth's Deep Operations Division had prepared me for exactly this kind of test. I moved across the shifting platforms with careful, controlled steps, reading each tilt before it happened, adjusting my weight with a precision that came from countless hours of training in far worse conditions than this. The crowd, expecting to see me stumble and fall within seconds, grew quiet as I crossed platform after platform without a single misstep. By the time I reached the far side of the gauntlet, the arena had gone almost completely silent. The Empress's expression, from what I could see at that distance, had shifted slightly. Not concern exactly. Curiosity, perhaps. The same curiosity I had noticed during our private audience weeks before. The second challenge was called the Trial of Wit, and it was designed, I understood immediately, to embarrass me in front of the crowd through a public contest of strategy rather than strength. I was seated across a stone table from a Threxan strategist, a decorated officer known throughout the Empire for his skill in tactical games. The rules were simple. We would each be given a shifting battlefield made of small glowing stones, representing fleets and resources, and we would take turns making decisions, trying to outmaneuver each other in a compressed simulation of war. The strategist smiled at me as the game began, clearly expecting an easy victory. He had spent his entire career studying Threxan military doctrine, memorizing formations passed down through generations of officers. What he did not know was that I had spent years studying exactly this kind of doctrine, not because I admired it, but because understanding an enemy's patterns was the first step toward defeating them. I had studied Threxan formations during briefings back on Earth, formations pulled from years of border conflict data, formations built to be predictable because predictability had always worked for an empire facing weaker opponents. I was not a weaker opponent pretending to be strong. I was someone who had spent years learning exactly how this game was supposed to be played, specifically so I could break its rules when the moment came. I let him take an early advantage, allowing him to grow confident, allowing the crowd to relax into the assumption that this trial, like so many before it, would end predictably. Then, piece by piece, I began dismantling his formations, using unconventional movements that did not follow traditional Threxan doctrine, forcing him to react instead of plan. By the middle of the match, murmurs had spread through the crowd. By the end, when his final formation collapsed under a sequence of moves he clearly had not anticipated, the arena had gone completely silent. The Empress leaned forward in her seat. The final challenge was the one the court had clearly designed as the true test, the one meant to finally, definitively prove that humanity was beneath the Empire in every way that mattered. It was called the Champion's Trial, a physical contest against one of the Empire's most celebrated warriors, a massive Threxan officer named Draven, who had won countless honors across a long career defending the Empire's borders. The rules, at least, were fair in structure. This was not a fight meant to cause harm. It was a contest of skill, using training weapons designed to register contact without causing injury, a tradition meant to test discipline and technique rather than brutality. Still, facing an opponent nearly twice my size, with decades more experience in a fighting style built entirely around Threxan physiology, the odds were clearly meant to favor him completely. Draven entered the arena to thunderous applause, raising his arms toward the crowd, clearly enjoying his role as the Empire's champion. I stood quietly at the opposite end of the arena floor, watching him, studying the way he moved, the confidence in his stance, the slight predictability in how he shifted his weight before advancing. "This will be quick, little husband," he said, loud enough for the nearby seats to hear, drawing another wave of laughter from the crowd. I said nothing. I simply waited. When the signal sounded, he moved forward immediately, relying on speed and strength, exactly as I had expected. I did not meet his advance directly. Instead, I moved sideways, letting his momentum carry him slightly off balance, using the brief opening to redirect rather than confront his strength head-on. It was a technique built around patience rather than power, the kind of discipline that came from years of training against opponents who could easily overpower me physically if I allowed the fight to happen on their terms. The crowd, expecting a quick and decisive victory for their champion, instead watched a contest unfold that grew longer and more careful and more tense with every passing minute. Draven grew visibly frustrated as his attempts to close the distance kept meeting empty space, as his powerful strikes kept finding nothing but air, as the human he had dismissed so easily continued to redirect his strength against him rather than trying to match it. I did not win through overwhelming force. I won through patience, through reading his patterns, through waiting for the single moment when his frustration caused him to overextend, allowing me to use his own momentum to bring the contest to its conclusion without ever needing to match his raw strength directly. When it was over, Draven stood breathing heavily, staring at me with an expression that had shifted from confidence to something closer to respect. The arena around us had gone completely, utterly silent. I turned to face the Empress's viewing box. She was standing now, her hands gripping the railing in front of her, her expression unreadable from this distance, though I could imagine, after weeks of studying her, exactly what she was feeling. Confusion, perhaps the beginning of concern. Perhaps, somewhere beneath her carefully composed exterior, the first quiet recognition that she had badly misjudged the man she had married. The announcer's voice, hesitant now, echoed through the stunned arena. The trial concludes. The human tribute has prevailed. The silence that followed lasted longer than any applause I had heard during my entire time in this empire. Then, slowly, from somewhere in the upper seats, a single sound broke through. Applause. Hesitant at first, then growing, spreading through sections of the crowd that clearly had not expected to feel anything like admiration toward a human, and yet found themselves unable to deny what they had just witnessed. Not every section joined in. Many nobles sat in stony silence, clearly displeased by what had unfolded in front of 1,000 worlds worth of broadcast drones. But enough of the crowd responded that the sound carried, undeniable, across the entire arena. I looked up toward the Empress's box one final time before the guards arrived to escort me back toward the palace. She had not moved from the railing. Her eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, I saw something in her expression that was not contempt and was not amusement. It was the beginning of doubt. As I walked back through the arena tunnels, guards flanking me on either side, I allowed myself a small, quiet breath of satisfaction. This trial had been designed to break me publicly, to prove to 1,000 worlds exactly what the Empress had promised in that throne room weeks earlier. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had shown the galaxy a glimpse, just a glimpse, of what I truly was. But the trial was only the beginning. I understood that clearly as I walked back toward my quarters that evening. Winning a public contest changed how the Empire's people saw me. It did not change the Empire itself. It did not change the fact that Earth still sat under the shadow of a power far greater than our own, still bound by a treaty that treated my presence here as a symbol of surrender. Somewhere out among the stars, beyond the reach of Threxan sensors, a network I had spent years helping to build was waiting for exactly this kind of moment. A moment when the galaxy's attention would be focused, however briefly, on a single quiet human who had just proven himself far more capable than anyone had expected. That night, alone in my quarters, I finally allowed myself to think seriously about the next stage of a plan I had been carrying since long before I ever set foot on this world. The mockery was over. What came next would decide everything. 3 days after the trial, the Empress summoned me to her private chambers, and this time there were no guards standing between us, no advisors watching from the corners of the room, just the two of us, and the quiet hum of the palace settling into evening. She stood by a tall window overlooking the capital, her back to me when I entered, her reflection faint against the glass. "The court cannot stop talking about you," she said, without turning around. "Officers who once mocked your presence now ask quiet questions about your training. Nobles who laughed at our wedding now wonder what else they might have gotten wrong." "I only did what was asked of me," I said carefully. She finally turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression I had not seen before. Not anger, not amusement, something closer to genuine curiosity, mixed with the beginning of suspicion. "No," she said. "You did far more than what was asked. A defeated soldier, chosen at random, does not move through a shifting gauntlet without a single misstep. He does not dismantle a decorated strategist using formations our own officers have never seen. He does not stand against Draven, one of our finest warriors, and win through patience rather than desperation." I said nothing, choosing instead to let the silence stretch between us, watching her carefully. "Tell me the truth, Ethan," she said, using my name for what might have been the first time since our wedding. "Who did Earth truly send me?" I had known this moment would come eventually, ever since the trial had ended, and the applause had rippled unevenly across a stunned arena. I had spent the past 3 days deciding exactly how much to reveal, and exactly when. Standing here now, watching her wait for an answer with something that looked almost like respect rather than contempt, I understood that the moment had finally arrived. "My military record was sealed before I ever left Earth," I said. "What the Empire received was a version of me built for exactly this purpose. A husband no one would suspect of anything, because no one believed humanity capable of anything beyond simple survival." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And the truth? I spent 6 years in a division of Earth's military that does not appear in any public record," I said. "We were trained to operate inside hostile territory without support, without weapons beyond what we could improvise, relying entirely on patience, observation, and timing. Earth did not send me here only as a tribute, Empress. It sent me here because a palace full of people who believed humanity was beneath them would speak freely in front of a husband they considered furniture." For a long moment, she said nothing at all. I watched her process the weight of what I had just told her, watched the pieces of the past several weeks rearrange themselves behind her eyes. The quiet husband who never spoke unless spoken to. The prisoner who somehow moved like a soldier during morning exercises no one thought to question. The man who had absorbed months of careless conversations from guards and nobles who assumed he understood nothing. "You have been listening," she said slowly, "this entire time." "Every day," I said. "And what exactly have you learned?" I met her eyes directly, no longer bothering with the humble posture I had worn for months. "I have learned that your empire is far less united than it appears from this palace. I have learned that noble houses like Lord Crin's family have resented the crown for generations, waiting quietly for an opportunity to reclaim what they lost. I have learned that officers across your military question the wisdom of continued expansion, while outer worlds grow increasingly resentful of taxes they see little benefit from. I have learned, Empress, that an empire built on fear rather than loyalty is far more fragile than it looks from a throne." Her hands tightened at her sides. "You are describing rebellion." "I am describing what already exists," I said. "I did not create these divisions. I simply listened long enough to understand them." She stepped closer, her expression hardening into something colder, more guarded. "And what do you intend to do with this information?" This was the moment. I had rehearsed it countless times in my mind during quiet hours in my quarters, weighing exactly how much to reveal, exactly how to frame what came next. Earth's plan had never been built around a single dramatic confrontation. It had been built around patience, around allowing an empire's own weaknesses to unravel it from within, guided quietly by someone positioned close enough to apply pressure at precisely the right moments. "Nothing has happened yet that cannot still be resolved peacefully," I said. "But you should know, Empress, that Earth never truly surrendered after the border conflict. We regrouped, we rebuilt, and over these past months, while your court mocked a quiet human husband standing at your side, a network of contacts across your own empire has been quietly cultivated, waiting for exactly this moment." "You are telling me humanity has been planning rebellion within my own empire," she said, her voice low and dangerous now. "I am telling you that humanity has been planning survival," I said. "There is a difference, though I understand it may not feel that way from where you stand." She turned away from me abruptly, walking back toward the window, staring out over the glittering lights of her capital, as though searching for some flaw in what I had told her, some crack in the story that would allow her to dismiss it entirely. But I could see, even from behind, the tension in her shoulders, the recognition slowly settling into place. "Lord Crin," she said quietly, almost to herself, "you have spoken with him." "Several times," I admitted. "He speaks openly around someone he considers harmless. Many of your nobles do. And what has he told you?" "Enough," I said, "to understand that his family has been waiting for an opportunity to challenge your authority for a very long time. I did not create that ambition, Empress. I simply recognized it, the same way I recognized every other crack that already existed within your court before I ever arrived." She was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Why are you telling me this now? You could have continued gathering information quietly. You could have waited, built your network further, struck when I least expected it. Instead, you are standing here, explaining your intentions directly to the person you claim to be working against." It was a fair question, and I had asked myself the same thing more than once over the past 3 days. "Because Earth does not want to destroy your empire," I said. "We want to survive within it, on terms that do not require pretending we are lesser than we are." "You called me a pet in front of your entire court, Empress. You called humanity a crawling species. I understand why. From where you stood, that description matched everything you believed to be true. I am here now, telling you directly, because I would rather you understand exactly what you are facing before events move beyond anyone's control." She turned back to face me, and for the first time since our wedding, I saw something in her expression that resembled genuine uncertainty, the look of someone who had built their entire understanding of the world around a single, confident assumption, only to watch that assumption crumble in real time. "You could have simply told me you were dangerous," she said. "Instead, you let me mock you in front of 1,000 worlds. Would you have believed me if I had told you on our wedding day?" I asked. She almost laughed, though there was no humor left in the sound. "No," she admitted, "I would not have." "That is why I waited," I said. "Sometimes the truth only becomes believable once someone has already seen it proven in front of them." Silence stretched between us again, longer this time, heavier. Outside her window, the capital continued its evening routine, entirely unaware that within these private chambers, an empire's future was quietly shifting direction. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "That depends on you," I said. "Earth has no interest in destroying what you have built, Empress. We have interest in being treated as equals rather than tribute. If you are willing to consider a different kind of relationship between our peoples, one built on respect rather than conquest, then everything that has been quietly set in motion can still be redirected toward peace rather than conflict. And if I am not willing?" I held her gaze steadily. "Then you should understand that the network I have built within your own court, among nobles who resent your rule and officers who question your expansion, will not simply disappear because you refuse to listen. The cracks in your empire existed long before I arrived, Empress. I only showed you where to look." She studied me for a long moment, and I watched her weigh everything I had told her against months of assumptions that had clearly begun collapsing the moment I walked through her arena gauntlet without missing a single step. "You are not what I expected, Ethan Cole," she finally said. "No," I agreed. "I imagine I am not." Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of her palace sensors, ships that had been quietly gathering for months were waiting for a signal, ready to reveal themselves the moment circumstances required it. Inside the palace, nobles who had spent generations resenting the crown were beginning to whisper more openly about change. And standing in front of the woman who had mocked me on my wedding day, I finally understood that the quiet plan Earth had built around patience and observation was no longer simply gathering information. It was ready to move. "The galaxy believed this marriage was humanity's surrender," I said quietly. "I think it is about to discover exactly how wrong that belief truly was." The Empress said nothing more that evening. She simply watched me leave her chambers, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, I walked away, without needing to hide anything at all. 7 days after my conversation with the Empress, the capital woke to the sound of alarms echoing across every district, and I knew, standing quietly at my window as the first light of morning broke over the glowing gardens, that the moment I had been preparing for had finally arrived. The Empress had not agreed to change course. I had given her the choice honestly, laid it out clearly during our private conversation, and part of me had hoped she would take it. But an empire built on generations of unquestioned authority does not bend easily, even when its own ruler begins to sense the ground shifting beneath her. In the days following our conversation, I had watched her grow quieter, more guarded, more suspicious of the nobles around her, yet ultimately unwilling to loosen her grip on the very structure that had made her so certain of her own power. Lord Kryn moved first. Word spread through the palace within hours that several noble houses, families who had waited generations for an opportunity to challenge the crown, had declared their intention to withdraw support from the Empress's rule. It was not an act of violence. It was something far more dangerous to an empire built on appearances. It was public doubt, spoken aloud, spreading from house to house like a fire finally given permission to burn. At the same time, far beyond the reach of Threxan sensors, ships that had been quietly gathering for months began moving toward the capital system, not as an invading force, but as a presence, a statement, a signal that Earth was no longer willing to remain silent about the terms of a marriage built on humiliation. I was summoned to the throne room by midday, the same hall where I had knelt on my wedding day, surrounded by nobles who had laughed at my humiliation without a single thought for what might come afterward. This time, when the doors opened, the hall was far from silent. Nobles argued in tense clusters, officers moved quickly between advisors, and at the center of it all, seated on her black crystal throne, the Empress watched the chaos unfolding around her with an expression I recognized immediately: fear, carefully hidden behind practiced composure. "You did this," she said, as I approached, her voice carrying clearly across the tense hall. "I told you exactly what would happen if you refused to consider a different path," I said. "I did not create the resentment in your court, Empress. I simply gave it a reason to speak. And now half my nobility questions my authority, while human ships gather at the edge of my own capital system," she said, rising from her throne, her composure beginning to crack for the first time since I had known her. "Is this your idea of peace?" "It is my idea of leverage," I said. "There is a difference. My people did not come to destroy your empire, Empress. They came to ensure that whatever happens next, humanity is finally treated as something more than tribute." The hall around us had grown quieter, nobles and officers alike turning to watch this exchange unfold, sensing, perhaps, that whatever happened in the next few moments would decide far more than the fate of a single marriage. "You expect me to simply accept this?" she asked, "to stand before my own court and admit that a human, a supposed pet, orchestrated the greatest challenge to my authority in a generation?" "I expect you to make a choice," I said. "You can continue treating this moment as an attack, gathering your remaining loyal forces, preparing for a conflict that will cost lives on both sides and ultimately weaken an empire already fractured by its own internal doubts. Or you can recognize what I am actually offering you." "And what exactly is that?" she asked, her voice tight with barely controlled tension. "A way forward that does not require humiliation on either side," I said. "Earth does not seek your throne, Empress. We seek recognition as equals, a treaty rewritten on terms that reflect what actually happened here, rather than the fiction the galaxy was told on my wedding day. Your empire remains yours to govern, but the era of treating other species as tribute, as pets, as lessons for the rest of the galaxy to fear, ends today." The hall remained utterly silent, every noble, every officer, every servant, watching to see how their Empress would respond to a challenge unlike anything her rule had faced before. For a long, tense moment, she said nothing at all. I watched her gaze move slowly across the hall, across nobles whose loyalty had grown uncertain, across officers whose faces betrayed quiet calculation rather than blind obedience, and finally back to me, standing exactly where I had knelt months earlier, though I was not kneeling now. "If I refuse," she said quietly, "what happens? Then the ships waiting beyond your capital system will not need to fire a single weapon," I said. "They will simply remain, a visible reminder to every noble house currently questioning your authority that humanity is no longer something to be dismissed. Your empire will fracture from within, Empress, not because of anything Earth does, but because the cracks I found were always there, waiting for someone willing to acknowledge them honestly." She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, the slow, difficult recognition of a ruler realizing that the foundation she had always trusted completely was far less stable than she had ever allowed herself to believe. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "And if I accept, then we begin building something neither of our peoples has had before," I said, "a relationship based on respect rather than fear. Your throne remains secure, Empress, provided you are willing to lead an empire that no longer requires humiliating others to prove its own strength." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear the distant hum of the palace's ancient machinery, the quiet shuffle of nobles shifting uncomfortably in place, the weight of an entire empire's future balanced on a single decision. When the Empress finally moved, she did not retreat to her throne. She stepped down from the dais, walking slowly toward me, the same path she had walked on my wedding day when she had called me a pet in front of her entire court. This time, when she stopped in front of me, there was no contempt in her expression. There was something far more complicated, something closer to reluctant respect, mixed with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had just watched their entire understanding of the galaxy shift beneath their feet. "You told me once that I would regret laughing at you," she said, quiet enough that only those closest to us could hear. "I did not believe you." "I know," I said. "I believe you now," she said. Then, in front of her entire court, in front of nobles who had mocked me months earlier, in front of officers who had once dismissed humanity as beneath consideration, the Empress of 1,000 worlds lowered herself, not fully to her knees, but in a formal bow of acknowledgement reserved for equals rather than subjects, a gesture the hall had clearly never witnessed her offer to anyone before. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. It was not the silence of mockery, or shock, or fear. It was the quiet, uncertain silence of an empire watching its own understanding of the universe rearrange itself in real time. "Rise," I said quietly, echoing, almost without meaning to, the exact word she had once used to dismiss me. "There is no need for that between equals." She rose slowly, studying my expression, and for the briefest moment, something almost like a smile crossed her face. Tired and complicated, but real. "The galaxy will not know what to make of this," she said. "The galaxy watched you mock a human groom on his wedding day," I said. "Let them watch this moment too. Let them see exactly what happened when that mockery met something they never expected." Over the following weeks, word of what had happened inside the Threxan throne room spread quickly across 1,000 worlds, carried by the same broadcast networks that had once shown my humiliation to the entire empire. This time, the story was different. Nobles spoke of a human who had walked through an arena gauntlet without a single misstep, who had outmaneuvered one of the empire's finest strategists, who had stood against a celebrated warrior and won through patience rather than desperation, and who had ultimately forced an empress to reconsider everything she believed about the species she had once called beneath her. Earth's ambassadors, who had spent months believing this marriage represented nothing more than a painful surrender, suddenly found themselves negotiating from a position no one had thought possible only months earlier. The treaty that eventually emerged bore little resemblance to the humiliating terms originally imposed after the border conflict. Humanity was no longer tribute. We were partners, uneasy and cautious ones perhaps, but partners all the same, recognized across 1,000 worlds as a species that could not be dismissed simply because it lacked the size or strength of the empires around it. I remained in the palace, though everything about my presence there had changed. I was no longer watched by guards who assumed I might wander somewhere dangerous. I was no longer served meals in careful silence by staff who avoided conversation. Eurus, the quiet servant who had brought me food during those first lonely weeks, began speaking with me more openly, sometimes even sharing small pieces of palace gossip he once would never have trusted a human with. Lyra, the young guard who had first spoken to me in the gardens, eventually became someone I considered close to a friend, someone who had recognized, long before most of the court, that there was more to the quiet human husband than anyone initially believed. Even Lord Kryn, whose ambitions had helped set so much of this change into motion, found himself in a strange new position, respected by some for his willingness to challenge the crown, resented by others who saw his actions as opportunistic rather than principled. Politics, I had learned, rarely produced clean or simple outcomes, even when the largest questions had finally been resolved. As for the Empress, our relationship remained complicated, built on a foundation neither of us could have imagined during that first humiliating ceremony months earlier. We were not, by any measure, a couple bound by affection, but something had grown between us that I had not expected to find in this palace, a strange, cautious respect built entirely on the fact that each of us had finally seen the other clearly, without the comfortable assumptions that had shaped our first meeting. Late one evening, months after the throne room confrontation that had reshaped an empire's relationship with an entire species, I stood once again at the tall window of my quarters, watching the glowing gardens below, the same gardens where I had first spoken quietly with Lyra, where I had first begun mapping the cracks that would eventually change everything. The Empress joined me there, something she had never done during those early lonely weeks of my captivity. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked, studying the gardens alongside me. "The silence, the waiting, the humiliation you allowed yourself to endure before revealing what you truly were." I considered the question carefully before answering. "No," I said. "Every quiet moment I spent listening, every insult I allowed myself to absorb without response, brought us to exactly the outcome Earth needed. I do not regret patience, Empress. I have learned, over many years, that patience is rarely wasted, even when it looks, from the outside, like weakness." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the gardens glow softly under two distant moons. "The galaxy called this marriage humanity's surrender," she finally said. "I wonder what they will call it now." I thought about that question for a long moment, remembering the throne room on my wedding day, the laughter that had filled that hall, the mockery I had absorbed and carried quietly for months, waiting for the exact right moment to let it matter. "I think," I said slowly, "they will simply call it the day the galaxy finally learned not to underestimate what patience and quiet strength can accomplish, even when it arrives wearing the face of someone they assumed had already lost." She turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I had arrived on this world, months earlier, kneeling in front of a throne, surrounded by laughter I had promised myself I would answer, I saw something in her expression that no longer carried any trace of the contempt she had once shown so freely. Respect. Quiet, complicated, and entirely earned. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, across 1,000 worlds that had once watched a human groom kneel in humiliation, the story of what happened afterward continued to spread, reshaping how an entire galaxy understood a species they had once dismissed without a second thought. I had promised the Empress, on the day she mocked me in front of her court, that she would regret laughing. She never laughed at me again.